First off, thank you for joining us, whether online and in person, or welcome to the penultimate session of the Martin Center seminar series. For those of you who are new, the seminar is hosted and supported by the Department of Architecture at the University of Cambridge, and this is the 55th edition of the Martin Center Research Seminar Series, 55th series, indicating that we are running these for 55 years, which making our seminar series one of the longest running and enduring series in the field. And I think that one of the legendary of this Martin Center, these seminars are here with us with in the room, Professor Michal and Shanike. And thank you for welcome on both. And I guess that is a source of real pride for us. So this edition, our theme is resilience, which is simply follows how cities and their residents manage to be resilient in various urban disasters. Before we dive into today's seminar, I would like to take a moment of you to express our gratitude to our key individuals who have been instrumental in conducting this seminar series. Michael Saka, who is here with me, and he is in his final year of PhD. So he and Sam were with us, and Sam, I think he's running late, but they are like an enormous contribution to this seminar series to facilitate the seminar. So I think that we can show our appreciation for what they have done during this past few years with a round of applause. I'm also pleased to introduce two new members of the conveners, Ron and Michal, and who is and I should mention my name as well. I'm Hamid, and we are going to run the seminars during these years. So with that, let's turn to today's lecture. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Michal Morad as our speaker. She's assistant professor at the University of Cambridge, our Department of Architecture, and she directs Cambridge Cognitive Architecture. Michal will give a talk about demystifying spatial cognition research in architecture. So we will have about 45 minutes of a lecture and some time afterward for a Q&A. So I suppose that's all from me, and over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. The title of my talk is Demystifying Spatial Cognition Research in Architecture. And as both an architect and cognitive scientist, I believe that architecture uniquely and fundamentally challenges the idea that the whole is merely the sum of its parts, thus having direct implications for our everyday activities in building, if it's the way we find our way or lose it, and also the possibility of interacting with colleagues or evading them. In architecture, individual parts can vary significantly in form and material. Take stairs, for instance. In Rem Koolhaas's book that is videoed behind me, Elements of Architecture, he showcases the evolution of stairs in many forms, spiraling, floating, straight. And despite this variety, we instinctively know how to use stairs. This understanding is deeply ingrained in our everyday repeated exposure across many different contexts to different types of stairs. The part in this case is intuitive, it's familiar, and it's simple. However, this familiarity with individual parts does not necessarily translate into an understanding of the whole. In Architecture for Health, which is the other book, videotape behind me, Christian and Hans Nickel present hospital floor plans that share many of these parts, yet their overall layouts differ greatly. Even if we recognize typologies like courtyard or radial designs or a racetrack, the arrangement, the syntax of these parts in a specific context is often unfamiliar. And as a result, unlike in many other design disciplines, the whole is much greater than the sum of its parts. When we combine architectural elements, we aren't simply adding them together. Instead, emergent phenomena, such as visual connectivity, accessibility, and spatial coherence, begin to shape our experience of the entire space. In this example behind me, you can see this atlas that we've devised of hospital layouts and how the different arrangements translate into metrics that predict social interaction or potential for social interaction, accessibility, visibility, and the likes. Okay.
Yes, keep going. Sorry,
Okay.
just giving you more screen space.
Okay, so this unfamiliarity with the whole often makes it harder for us to immediately understand and navigate the space. Experience with one hospital, for instance, does not necessarily translate to another. It might provide clues for another, but each new layout feels different because of the unique spatial context and emergent qualities of the whole. And despite the sense of order that may emerge from these plans when viewed from an allocentric perspective, and a top-down one, like the one that we employ when we design, a user's egocentric perspective is far more constrained. Factors like limited field of view and cognitive processing capacity result in a far less orderly and legible perception of the same space. What seems logical on paper often feels overwhelming or generic in real life. And of course, the more complex the architectural whole is, this misalignment between our allocentric and our egocentric understanding of the space becomes much more pronounced. And this disconnect between how architects design and how users experience the space is exactly what led me, an architect by training, to pursue a PhD in cognitive science. I wanted to understand how architecture could remain a powerful tool in shaping human experience from the perspective of building users. And towards addressing this challenge, my new group in Cambridge tackles three interrelated questions. The first one is, how does the spatial configuration of complex buildings affect users' cognition, spatial behavior, and social dynamics? And how can we actually, the second question is really, how can we translate that knowledge and integrate it across the different stages of the architectural design process? Because it's one thing to know, and it's a whole different thing to be able to apply that knowledge in practice. And thirdly, I think a question which is significantly under researched is what happens once we design with this knowledge in mind? How does this actually affect our design communication, our design quality, and broadly our design cognition? And how, through this understanding, we can actually inform the questions that we ask and ask better questions, more relevant ones. To tackle each one of these questions, I employ a range of methods, and they're quite broad, ranging from behavioral experiments to tackle the first question, both in real world and in virtual environments, protocol analysis and speech analysis to tackle the third question, and modeling and simulation to tackle the second question of translating knowledge. And I'll demonstrate projects that address each question and the different methods that I use to apply to tackle it as part of this presentation. Starting with the first question, how architecture affects cognition, behavior, and social dynamics. And I guess that personally what led me to pursue this field was the question of wayfinding. My PhD body of work was really about wayfinding. How can we understand wayfinding not through signage, but actually through architecture? How can architecture itself facilitate wayfinding? And this translated into this series of manuscripts, essentially asking the question of how visibility afforded through spatial configuration affects wayfinding in multi-level environments, which is a slightly under-researched area. And for this particular study that I'm presenting here, we looked at the Solverein building by Sana Architects. It's a school of management. And on the left-hand side, you can see the control group, which is akin to the original building. In fact, what you see here is that multi-level building with the staircases enclosed in these concrete shafts. So as a user, when you enter this building, you don't really see the circulation elements. You need to look for them. And one of the ideas, or two ideas that came about on how we can improve wayfinding through architecture based on the original building were to increase visibility between floors. The first intervention or treatment, as scientists refer to it, was carving out atria in the second floor between the first and the second floor to increase visibility. And the second intervention was to expose or reveal the staircases through just replacing the glass facades. And because these interventions are extremely costly to actually build in the real world, we conducted a virtual reality experiment where we essentially asked participants to search for semantically defined goals. In this particular case, we asked them to look for an auditorium, an office, the roof terrace. And because this is a virtual reality experiment, which we could deploy either in a lab setting or online, our ability to actually get quite a substantial sample was met. So in this particular case, we had 700 participants, which we later on excluded many of them because of different entry requirements. But I think that this is a demonstration of how virtual reality, although it has many, many limitations, which I'm happy to address, could help us control for spatial variables, but also increase our sample size and participation. And because it's a virtual environment, again, we're able to collect very high resolution data about people's movement, about their gaze behavior. So for instance, if they're looking upwards and information seeking in the vertical or in the horizontal, we know exactly how much time it took them to reach their destinations, which paths they actually took. And our hypothesis was that increasing visibility, but not only increasing visibility through the atria intervention, but actually strategically by exposing the staircase would be the intervention that would improve wayfinding. In this particular case, improvement was making wayfinding more efficient. We can debate on that. If that's actually good for people and for our general health. And as you can see here, this is the path density output that was resulting from the experiment. You can see this for the base case, the original building. Here you can see the same mapping for the atria case, so not a lot of difference. And here you can see the glass intervention, where we exposed the staircases, which yielded a much more substantial difference in terms of path density. And in that sense, we confirmed our hypothesis, but we were slightly more curious to see this beyond, just efficiency. We could confirm statistically that on the y-axis, what you see here is total distance. So we do see that for the glass condition, participants were considerably, significantly more efficient relative to the glass and relative to the atria and base case conditions. But it's not only that. We also saw that they employed different types of wayfinding strategies. So if we look at the base case and the atria case, we measured the amount of time they spent in the circulation course. And what we've observed is that in the glass condition, they developed or they employed a completely different wayfinding strategy. They actually moved upwards and surveyed the space from within the circulation core, as opposed to the other two conditions where they exited the circulation core at each floor to perform a within search strategy. So it's not only about distance, it's also about the way we experience the building and the wayfinding strategies that we employ. And at a secondary step, we actually tried to identify strategies. We tried to identify if through this procedure called k-means clustering, we clustered all of the trajectories to identify if there were two dominant strategies or more. We ended up learning that there were two dominant strategies employed. The first one is the central point strategy, which we've seen in previous studies, where people enter the center of the ward or the center of the floor to seek information because they're more likely to get unobstructed views from that location. And then essentially, based on the cues that they perceive, go about wayfinding towards other locations. And the other strategy was the perimeter strategy. So people adhere to the edges of the building because people have, we know this from prior studies as well, people tend to adhere to edges because they provide a consistent frame of reference. So we've seen both of these strategies being employed, and these were the dominant ones. But interestingly, once we looked into individual differences. We tried to see if individuals actually have their own tendency or their own favorite strategy. We saw that for destinations that have high visibility, essentially, like for instance, what you can see here with the auditoria, the choice of strategy is almost identical for the majority of them. But once the destination is not so visible, all of a sudden, preferences towards individual strategies emerge. So individual differences do make a difference, but visibility is interacting with those individual differences. Now, as I said, this was my PhD work, and I was fascinated by wayfinding, but then I ended up with, I think, the point where many people who do wayfinding research end up in is that we only do this once, right? We arrive at a building, we're novices for the first time, but actually what we do more often and more regularly is we interact with people. And I begun developing a second phase of fascination with this idea of social interaction and how does spatial configuration affect interaction in buildings. And a lot of my work, my previous work that I'm not sharing here, was about hospitals. And I ended up meeting people who came from an entirely different world, the world of emergency medicine, and gradually realized that for them, one of the main ways to treat a patient is actually to converse with their colleagues, to interact with their colleagues and exchange information about the state of the patient. That led to an entirely different conversation about the spaces for emergency care, in this particular case in Switzerland, that led us to come up with this project, evidence-based architectural design for emergency departments to facilitate greater communication, collaboration, and care delivery. There are lots of people involved in this: medics, neuroscientists, psychologists, emergency medicine experts. And together we aim to really understand how the spatial design of emergency departments affects face-to-face interactions between caregivers and subsequently affects or translates to outcomes. In this particular case, we looked at outcomes that are at the individual level, so interruptions, for instance, but also ones that are at the team level, so care quality and perception of collaboration. We're just getting started with this project. It recently got funded through the Swiss National Science Foundation. And already we have a case study. This is the University Hospital in Zurich. And one of the biggest challenges when you do such a real world type of research is how do you capture the actual complexity of such an environment? And in this particular case, we went ahead with a point cloud mapping approach. We simply went, I think it was 2 or 3 in the morning to capture the layout of the department with a LiDAR scanner to be able to really understand. So if you really zoom in, you can see that the blue blocks here are essentially patient beds that are in corridors. If you compare, for instance, the architect's drawing of how that space should have functioned as opposed to this in the wild representation, it's completely different. The clutter and the amount of objects and their distribution in locations that were not so much intended for really changes its dynamics. So the first step was really, well, how do we capture a live representation of that environment, that complex environment? And after we've done that, we essentially tried to say, well, our hypothesis in this project is that one key factor stemming from configuration is visibility. And we hypothesized that visibility, assuming what is it that you see and how much that you see, would affect your likelihood of interacting with your colleagues. We haven't invented this hypothesis. We do rely on some prior evidence, but it was never really tested in such a rigorous way in this particular context. So after generating the point cloud, we took it into the world of video games and analyzed the view volume for from each of these green points that you see here to arrive at this view volume calculation, because we wanted to really understand statistically if how much we see, not what we see at this point yet, that's a bit more complicated, how much we see correlates with our tendencies to interact. So you probably are wondering at this point, so you know a lot about the space, but how do you know, or how do you actually capture interactions? And this really did entail a mixed methods approach, or the necessitated mixed methods approach, because it's quite an elusive thing to capture. In this instance, what we've done is we've used proximity badges. These are called rhythm badges. They were developed by colleagues at the MIT Media Lab. They essentially work with Bluetooth components. We have some of them that are on caregivers, and some of them that are actually acting as beacons. They're stationary in space, and the idea is that we can do two things. We can measure or record interactions between caregivers once they're in close proximity to one another, under 1 meter. We can contemplate if that's enough or not based on proxemics theory, and we can also localize the signal in space. So we can say exactly, not exactly, that also involved quite a lot of post-analysis, where exactly is that interaction actually happening. And this is what you see here. This is what you see here on the right. This is kind of the pulse of interactions mapped. This is a typical shift at the ED, and I'm not going to take you through the entire space, but I'm just going to give you the highlights. In the center, this is the cockpit. This is where all of the nurses and the doctors convene to be able to make decisions about patients, and they also see the inflow and outflow from the emergency department. In the back, you have offices that are designated for personal conversations with patients and their families. And you have patient rooms here on the sides. There are essentially two wings. Here you have nurse stations, back nurse station, and here it's not marked, but one of the most important locations is where the shift nurse is. This is the nurse that's in charge of coordinating information between all of the other caregivers. And we found a lot of things, but I think that our first finding is especially relevant for architects. I myself designed hospitals, so I can say I think it's relevant. I'm happy to take your feedback. But we found that actually between role interactions, so nurses to doctors, doctors to porters, occurred mostly in transitional areas, so in non-designated areas. These are, from a design perspective, the ones that are most negotiable, right? When you design a hospital, are you going to have the corridor wide? Are you going to have it narrow? Are you going to have it in length A, length B? These are all questions that come on a regular basis when you design a hospital. And in fact, our ability to confirm, at least in this particular case study, that it is important for between role interactions, I think is interesting. Another finding, not so surprising, but the effect size is, I hope, promising, is that seeing did affect, or the view volume. The greater the view volume was, the more probable healthcare workers were at interacting. So more interactions for people who are positioned in locations where they have a greater view volume. And again, a deeper analysis, which will follow, will try to understand through eye tracking, what exactly is it that they saw? Because seeing a lot or seeing more is not necessarily what this is all about. And lastly, at the end of each shift, we gave them a survey. We gave the healthcare workers a survey. We asked them what was their perceived quality of care for that shift, their perceived interaction, perceived communication. And based on this, we ended up analyzing the correlation between the amount of interaction per caregiver and their care quality perception. We found that people who interacted more perceived their care quality as being better, which is interesting. And I think if we manage to confirm that also through objective outcomes, not only perceived ones, we could possibly make strong arguments for why design matters in emergency departments. As I said, this is just the first case study in 133. We're going to analyze 133 emergency departments in Switzerland, probably the largest data set of this kind, where we compose spatial metrics with interaction data. In work package 2, we're going to kind of blow up the methodology that I just showed, not only looking at where interactions occurred through the badges, but also doing video reflexive ethnography. So following around caregivers and trying to see what's their interpretation of the interactions they experience, because we want to be able to understand what are positive interactions and what are negative ones, and where do they actually occur in space. Then the idea is to take the behavioral data and spatial data and train a model to be able to use it for predictive purposes. Try to really predict, based on the layout, where would interactions occur, where would good interactions occur, where would bad interactions occur, and can we possibly even, based on the data that we're going to have, predict outcomes. That remains to be seen. And lastly, and I'm going to discuss this at the end, the idea is to use these design tools to inform design processes or inform design processes of emergency departments in Switzerland in a co-design fashion. I'm going to present this afterwards. It's part of our collaboration with the Swiss Center for Design and Health. So a lot of what I showed and a lot of the work that I've done also in my PhD eventually boils down to a few plots. And being an architect myself, I know that architecture doesn't necessarily view this as meaningful or as useful or as inspiring. And a lot of the work that I've done in recent years was trying to say, well, let's take this data and try to translate it into formal models that we could embed in architectural representations, especially given the fact that the majority of them are nowadays digital. And this is by no means a new concept. This has been ongoing since the 60s and even before in architecture, but it mostly addressed environmental phenomena. So these simulation models that you see in the back, they're, depending on who you speak, they're quite good at predicting a lot of these environmental phenomena because they are relatively stable. And if you have good data, then you end up getting good prediction. But when it comes to behavioral phenomena, it's much more complicated, and there the breadth of models coming from transportation and from neuroscience and other fields is broader. But I think that the one deficit, in my view, is really how we represent space. How do we represent the environment in a way that could capture all of these nuances that architecture is all about? How much you can see, the adjacency between functions, and the likes. And as part of my PhD, I developed a platform for simulating wayfinding in multi-level buildings based on behavioral experiments that I've conducted and other people have conducted. It's called CogArc. And the idea is that you take building information models, which is, again, a semantic representation of buildings, and through a pre-processing, post-processing pipeline, we generate a lot of information about that space that could be used to inform wayfinding through a computational agent, in this case, a cognitive agent. I'll explain what that means in a second. So these include things like an occupancy grid, so knowing what is walkable and what is not, an isovist field telling us where you can see more from, where you can see less from, zones that correspond with areas. So this is a sitting room, and this is a day room. We talk about hospitals. And then developing agents and tasks. So agents tend to go from direct routing agents, the ones that know everything about the world and simply search within that world. If we talk about wayfinding or navigation, we often refer to these as shortest path agents. They know exactly where the destination is and where the origin is, and they calculate the shortest path. Sometimes they weigh it by, for instance, crowd levels or angularity, so seeking for the least angular or the least crowded path. And the other type is cognitive agents. These cognitive agents have strategies like the ones that I've shown in the previous experiment. They have emotions, stress levels, and everything that is required to perform, and especially vision, that is required to perform a bounded search, such that you don't really know where the destination is. You're looking or you're searching locally, and based on local cues, you're able to calculate gradually a path towards the destination. Often that path is much more erroneous, lengthy, and complicated than the one that the direct routing agents employ. And they're both useful for for different tasks. So if we're talking about habitual behavior, people often employ the shortest path once they are familiar with the environment. But once they're novices, they would often employ something like the cognitive agent would know how to do. And there's a GUI for these simulations and an analysis engine. And the idea is to really equip and empower architects with this type of model to say, well, if I have a layout or if I have a building model, I can empower my own intuition to be able to devise or to understand how it would impact, in this particular case, wayfinding. And this is how it looks like. You can see the shortest path agent upstairs already founding its path, and the cognitive agent still looking through vision and a bunch of other strategies. I'm happy to elaborate on that as well. But as in all models, the proof is in validation, or what we refer to as the goodness of fit. And in this particular case, this is the simulation cycle by Gilbert. We have a target system, which is the real world. We have some collected data that represents how that real world system works. And then we have a model. As someone said, I always forget the name of that person. All models are wrong, but some are useful. I think that my validation process and others does manage to align with that saying. So we have a model, and that model is used to run simulations. And eventually what we do is we judge the goodness of fit between the simulated data and the collected data. And I won't go too much in depth, but I'll show that for the experiment that I showed you before, we ran such a procedure. We essentially ran two types of simulations, the cognitive agents and the shortest path agents. And in yellow, you can see the participant paths. And we compared, amongst many other things, the distances across all tasks and across the three buildings, the base, the atria, and the glass. And although our cognitive agents are overshooting, so they're much less efficient than humans, than real humans, which are in yellow, they still kind of show a similar trend. All of them, or most of them, were considerably more efficient in the glass conditions, similarly to humans, whilst the red represents the shortest path agents that don't really have vision, know exactly where the destination is, and that volumetric intervention didn't really affect their wayfinding. So you can see essentially a flat line. Architecture is not really accounted for, and these are at the heart of many of the simulation software that we're using in industry, from mass motion and the likes. Once you have a simulation model, you can apply it to different types of environments, which is exactly why it's useful. And here you can see some of my students' works at ETH. I did my PhD there, at Zurich. They took hospital layouts and they simulated the movement trajectories of different caregivers. And they tried to really understand through this typological investigation, how do different typologies affect wayfinding, but not only, also social interactions, for which they developed their own model. Again, the validation problem persists. And based on that investigation, they proposed and subjected their own design variations to the same process of simulation. I'm about to finish, so yeah. But again, as I said, this is all nice and well, but how does it actually affect our design cognition and our design engagement? And this is kind of what we wanted to test in this following study. We developed this sketch editor where the idea was to say, well, the best ideas don't come at the point where the building is already, well detailed and all ready for construction. It's actually at this napkin stage or at the sketching stage. So we said, well, let's develop a very low level simulation where you can sketch. And as you sketch, get different behavioral analytics, from space index analysis, showcasing visibility, to trajectories. And let's give two groups of students a task to design a hospital with a preset list of program for a specific set of design criteria. In this particular case, less walking distances by nurses and better supervision or oversight over patients. And let's just have one manipulation. The first group, I don't show this here, but the first group had this sketch editor with the analytics. The second had the exact same sketch editor without the analytics. So just sketching. And again, because it's a virtual environment, we were able to record everything from their gaze behavior to things like their mouse clicks. And one of the results that we found interesting was the fact that if we look at the design moves or the amount of mouse clicks, which are kind of a proxy for that, on the y-axis and the time on the x-axis, we gave them 60 minutes for this task. At the first 20 minutes, they are somewhat aligned in terms of engagement. We refer to this metric as design engagement. After 20 minutes, we see this bifurcating. We see that all of a sudden the group that had the behavioral analytics is substantially more engaged. This could be related. We're now replicating the study at an actual practice, and we'll get to you with the results. But this could, of course, be related to the wow factor and to many other novelty-related artifacts. But in this particular case, we looked at individual factors like education levels and age, and in fact, the effect remained. So this is, I think, an interesting question to further explore. How does designing with these types of tools actually affect our outcomes? And when we looked at the design variations themselves, I'm always asking the audience, which group do you think that either of these relate to? The group with the analytics or the group without? Tell you, the group on the right is the group that received the cognitive metrics. And when we asked a panel of architects to score the different variations, they indeed scored the variations on the right as being more creative and more unique and more in line with the design brief that we laid out initially. Lastly, the medium is the message. And I think that one of the things that I was always curious about is, okay, we generate all of this evidence and we project it and we come with it to meetings, but do people actually, or do stakeholders in this case, actually make sense of it properly? And there are a lot of factors that come into play when we ask these questions, from spatial abilities to our actual positioning, right, of when viewing the evidence. And what you see here in the back is a video from the Evident project where we went to the Swiss Center for Design and Health and created a full-scale mock-up of a part of the emergency department. And we brought in the team from the emergency department to be able to, project the evidence that we've collected on who interacted where. And we asked them, can you identify who those interaction hotspots belong to? And then afterwards, we had this entire session for role-playing simulations and trying to intervene with this space. But we also had another group that only has been given this type of information. So we had a floor plan and we gave them the hotspots for the different types of healthcare workers in a tablet form. And our question here was actually, does the medium matter? Does being immersed in evidence and viewing it from an egocentric perspective, as opposed to seeing it like we're very much accustomed to as architects from an allocentric perspective, does that matter? And our matter was actually answered through the correctness of their responses. Were they actually able to attribute the patterns that they've seen to the right care worker? And what we've actually seen is that significantly, the people who were in the immersive environment were much more able to interpret the evidence correctly. Again, an interesting question to further explore. Thank you. My group, Cambridge Cognitive Architecture, is new, recruiting new members. I invite you all to look around, and thank you so much.